This is lecture number 24B. You recall in our series, The ABCs of Communism. Now, you'll recall in the last lecture we stopped with the discussion of the Panic of 1873, is what it's called in the United States. The same thing, and I pointed out, had happened instantly in Buenos Aires as well. Now, as a consequence of all of these workers being sent to the street in 1873, we have a problem for all of these white industrial workers. And the way it was resolved at the time was the government launched a campaign to open up territories that were now, or had been, homelands of indigenous peoples, largely on the Pampas region. And the idea was, of course, that they would be wiped out in a genocidal kind of war, the way the North Americans wiped out the Indians in their West after the Civil War. And so we have the bloody dawn of capitalism in Argentina now in full swing. It had not amounted to much in the capitalist world before the last half of the 1800s, that is Argentina, but the growth rate from 1860 through 1930, as a consequence, first of all, of this clearing of land of indigenous peoples, the movement of disgruntled and therefore potentially revolutionary white workers out of Buenos Aires and Entre Rios into the Pampas region, took the pressure off of the capitalism as a system. And now these settlers, of course, were confronted with an entirely new set of problems. And just the same as the settlers that moved west in the U.S. were confronted with an entirely new set of problems. First of all, they had to defeat the Indians. Secondly, they had to start some kind of agriculture or cattle farming or sheep farming. This capitalist boom was financed, however, by the export of agricultural goods after 1860, in the same way, one might say, as Russian industrialization was financed by the government takeover of agriculture, which is what collectivization was. Now, the rate of growth between 1860 and 1890 was so impressive to foreign observers that many of them began to talk about Argentina as the homeland for the United States of South America. Well, however that may be, the workers in would turn out to be, it was going to take a lot longer up there. And that kind of unification didn't really start, despite the Bolivarian desire for it to start, until recent years. Now Argentina is being linked rapidly with the rest of South America into an economic system. The Mercosur, the common market for South America, was one of the first steps, and of course that has evolved into a much larger organization than the four countries that founded it: Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Now a much bigger thing, and now we have the Trans-Amazon Railroad, which the Chinese have agreed to finance and build, that will link the Brazilian Atlantic to the Peruvian Pacific. There are also Trans-Amazon highways that are being built. This is so important because the Amazon rainforest, which is a huge part of the center of South America, and for South America to be realistically linked the way North America is, that Amazon rainforest has to be conquered. What that means is different things to different people. I'm not going to get off into that except to say that this was the objective 100 years ago in South America, and it's only now becoming a fact. What it did do, besides liquidating the indigenous peoples there, was to create this demand for more European labor, which came largely from Italy and Spain. And as I pointed out before, these workers were educated workers who came with anarchist ideas or Marxist ideas. In 1870, during the presidency of Sarmiento, the total debt of Argentina had amounted to about 48 million pesos, but within a year it had doubled. Now, what that tells you is there's a huge influx of capital, and where is it going? Well, it's going into the construction of more factories. These are factories that have to be constantly retooled, because no sooner will have a capitalist have set up a factory than somebody somewhere will have found a way to make that machinery work even better. So now he's got to make this typical choice capitalists always have to make, and that is, am I going to invest in new machinery, or am I going to call it a day and go out of business? So this was exactly the same thing as was happening in North America and Europe. Avellaneda became president after winning the 1874 presidential election, and his coalition came to power with a party called the Partido Autonomista Nacional, or PAN we're going to call it in this lecture, Argentina's first national party, and all of its presidents until 1916, that is from 1874 to 1916, would come from this government party. So in that sense, it was similar to what Calle set up in Mexico with the PRI, what became the Party of the Institutional Revolution, and governed that country uninterruptedly until, 12, 13 years ago, and after which we've had a couple of PAN presidents, and now back to the Priista guy, Nieto. At any rate, a very similar situation occurred there in Argentina as had occurred in Mexico. In 1881, the government announced a decentralized bimetal standard to go into effect for a year and a half in July 1883. And since no national monetary authority existed, convertibility was up to the 5 banks of issue. Around December 1884, these banks of issue began to refuse to exchange gold at par to fiat. In other words, there was only some kind of paper currency which the Argentine issuing banks would credit as being gold-backed. The profitability of the agriculture sector attracted foreign capital for railways and industries, and by foreign capital we mean primarily British. British capital investments went from about £20 million in 1880 to £157 million in 1890. During the 1880s, investment began to show some diversification as capital began to flow from France, Germany, and Belgium, though UK investment still accounted for 2/3 of the total foreign capital, which almost saying 2/3 of all of the capital that was being invested in local industry. In 1890, Argentina was the destination of choice for British investment in Latin America, a position it held until World War I. By then, Argentina had absorbed between 40% and 50% of all British investment outside the United Kingdom. Despite its dependence on the British market, Argentina managed a 6.7% annual rate of growth of exports between 1870 and 1890. Which means that white workers that had survived the war and the new ones who were flowing in there had relatively secure jobs, and they had unions. The first Argentine railway was a 6-mile road, and that had been built in 1854, but by 1885 there were 2,700 miles of railway in Argentina that were open for traffic, and these new railways brought livestock to Buenos Aires from all of these capitalist farmers across the Pampas. And in Buenos Aires, the cattle and sheep were slaughtered and processed in meatpacking plants and then shipped out to the old world. So there was a constant flow of cash back into Argentina from consumers in Europe, and to a degree in North America, but mostly this was in Europe. Selman and the Bering Crisis. Next point I want to bring out is that the Juarez-Selman PNA administration saw a substantial increase in the ratio of debt to GDP toward the end of his tenure, and an increasing weakness in the fiscal situation. The Bering Brothers Merchant Bank had developed a close and profitable association with Argentina, and when the Selman government was unable to make its payments to the House of Bering, a financial crisis ensued. Now, the crisis was caused by a lack of coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy, which you can go into in your book, but the point is that it led to the collapse of the banking system, and the financial crisis of 1890 left the government with no funds for its immigration subsidies program, which was abolished in 1891. But they didn't really need immigration subsidies anymore because workers were glad to get out of Italy and Spain and get as high wages as they were getting there, and without all of the problems associated with constantly having to go on strike. Loans to Argentina were severely curtailed and imports had to be cut sharply. The value of Argentine exports did not surpass the 1889 peak until 1898. Well, another man came to power, and another PNA president named Carlos Pellegrini, and he accelerated the rate of capitalist expansion, bringing stability and growth, and with the restoration of convertibility, that is, paper that could be converted into gold on demand. In 1899, in the decade from 1903 to 1913, the gross domestic product increased at an annual rate of 7.7%. So you can see that capitalism was working at its best at this point in Argentina. Stability meant that industry could expand even faster, jumping by 9.6%. By 1906, Argentina had paid off the entire 1890 default, and a year later, the country re-entered the international bond market. So, a good economy solved the problems for them. After 1853 and through the 1930s, fiscal instability was a transitory phenomenon. The capitalist depressions of 1873 to 1877 and 1890 to 91 witnessed sending masses of proletarians to the street, while capitalists invested in new machinery. Therefore, capitalists grew richer with each of these depressions, and to improve the trade balance, they now needed to substitute imports, which they proceeded to do. In other words, everything you import you have to pay gold for, and so the gold is flowing out of the country. If you don't want to get into another position of not having any gold, you're going to have to restrict that. And the way you would do it is by building factories in Argentina that can create the things that you're importing. By 1914, about 15% of the Argentine labor force was involved in manufacturing, and 20% in other supportive activities like transportation and construction. In 1913, Argentina's income per head was on a par with that of France and Germany, and more than that of Italy and Spain. And this again fueled the desire of many Europeans to flee to Argentina. At the end of 1913, Argentina had a gold stock of 59 million pounds, or 3.7% of the world's monetary gold. And Argentina now produced 1.2% of the world's economic output. Julio Roca took command of the economy as president for the PAN party, and this was an alliance between capitalist latifundists and industrial capitalists. In other words, latifundia, by which we mean mainly cattle farming and sheep farming on the Pampas, had become such a big industrialized business that it had changed. It was no longer small white farmers with cattle ranch and a few hundred head of cattle that they would take to a local railroad spur and then ship to Buenos Aires. Now, these guys have been consolidated, bought out, and brought into larger capitalist agribusinesses. These guys have the same outlook on economics as the industrial capitalists in Buenos Aires. So the Julio Roca, who is the guy that won the war for them, and what they call the Desert War in Argentina, came to power, and he would stay in power until 1916. During his presidency and the 34 years of his PAN successors, Roca created PAN political alliances that gave him and PAN almost absolute control of the Argentine political scene until midway through World War I. Now, you recall that I mentioned that in 1910 the first transatlantic underwater cable had been laid from Europe to Buenos Aires. Well, the country's economy witnessed transformation from simple farming to industrial agriculture, as we have seen, and the latter was accompanied by huge European immigration that provided the labor power for the capitalist factories And these were workers who did not have to give up contact with their homeland because of the telegraph. So they had that kind of contact, and it also meant, remember that we're only a few years away from the Bolshevik Revolution. So when that happens, they're going to know about it and instantly, and that's why Argentina is going to have the first Communist Party, even before Jose Allen is designated by our man Barodin to organize Latin America. Barodin doesn't arrive in Mexico until the end of 1919, and so that is why that happened that particular way. The Law for Common Education of 1884 guaranteed universal free non-religious education to all children. This and other government policies were strongly opposed by the Roman Catholic Church in Argentina, and this led the Vatican to break off diplomatic relations with Argentina. So this was, however, a Latin American-wide phenomenon. We've seen already what Calles did to the Catholic Church after 1924 in Mexico. So the same thing was going to happen in Argentina. It was happening pretty much everywhere. Argentina temporarily resolved its border disputes with Chile. Roca's government and the PAN government that followed aligned with the Argentine oligarchy of Lavistas. Roca had to return to lead this opposition, and he alienated important sections of the landed oligarchy because of the nature of the way the war developed. Dislocations caused by the foregoing capitalist depressions allowed the Civic Union opposition party to start a coup d'etat against this PAN government. 3 men led this Civic Union party in what was called the Revolution of the Park. One was Leandro Alam, another former president Bartolomé Mitre, and the moderate socialist Juan B. Justo. By moderate socialist, they mean a Gompers type of AFL socialist union leader. Though it failed in its main goals, the revolution forced Horace Selman's resignation and marked the decline of the generation of 1880. Anarchism infected Argentina because most of the European immigration to South America as a whole came from Spain and Italy, which you will recall are the 2 European countries, in Western Europe anyway, where anarchism had the most influence. It was for that reason Marx had to send the first international headquarters to Philadelphia, and therefore it to be dissolved, to keep it out of the hands of anarchists. Well, many of these Italians and Spaniards coming into Buenos Aires had been in anarchist unions. And between 1885 and 1889, the anarchist Enrico Malatesta had arrived and spent a great deal of time there building an anarchist union. The working class was barely into the electoral system at the time. One reason was that 70% of the adult males in Buenos Aires were disenfranchised as foreigners. In other words, in order to vote in an Argentine election, you had to be an Argentine national citizen. And if 70% of these Argentinians by this time in the Buenos Aires Entre Rios region were now not yet Argentine citizens, so they couldn't even vote. The bourgeoisie divided in 1891 between the Civic Union and the PAN. And what eventually happened was that a man named Hipólito Yrigoyen became president, and he was from the Radical Civic Union Party that had challenged PAN. Well, he was followed by a fellow named Carlos Pellegrini, who took over and proceeded to solve the economic crisis which afflicted the country and earned him the name of the Storm Sailor. Fearing another wave of opposition from Roca like the one that had been imposed on Selman, Pellegrini remained moderate in his presidency, ending his predecessor's efforts to distance Roca from political control. The following governments did the same, and nevertheless, the ruling classes would need Roca in the presidency again. In 1898, Roca became president again in a politically unstable situation. Massive socialist-led strikes and anarchist uprisings threatened the bourgeois order. Might note here that the socialists were going to form a political party, but the anarchists didn't believe in a political party. What they believed in was strikes in the unions, which would eventually lead to an overthrow of the state and the creation of an anarchist system. So, what did happen was that the Socialist Party, under the leadership of Gomper's kind of guys like Juan Justo, passed certain kinds of legislation which satisfied the working class and therefore gave them, or at least temporarily satisfied them. They got the Palacios Law, which regulated child and female labor by setting working hours and requiring Sunday to be a day of rest. These don't seem like such radical ideas to us today, but at the time they were. PAN went out. The hegemony of the PAN ended in 1910 with the election of Roque Sáenz Peña to the presidency. Peña was a progressive member of the PAN who sponsored the Sáenz Peña law, making voting mandatory, secret, and universal among males aged 18 or more. Under this law, the first non-PAN president since 1880 was elected in 1916, and that was Hipólito Yrigoyen of the Radical Civic Union. Well, the World War caused another dislocation in Argentina in the form of a recession that began as quickly as the World War began in the fall of 1914. As the international flow of goods and labor declined, foreign capital refocused on war manufacturing in European countries, and that is in the imperialist countries that were at war with each other. Consequently, capitalist investment in Argentina came to a complete standstill. It's always easier to invest in war contracting because you know the government's going to pay you, and that's where you would want to put your money, rather than in some foreign venture as in Argentina where you don't know what's going to happen to the factory that you're supposed to be financing. Great Britain, during the course of the First World War, had become entirely indebted to the United States and would never again export capital to Argentina in the same amounts as it had before. The United States, on the other hand, came out of the First World War as a political and financial superpower. The U.S. caps had so many opportunities right next door to them in Mexico and Canada that they showed no interest in Argentina and in Central America and Venezuela. Neither the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange nor the private domestic banks developed rapidly enough to replace British capital. The situation for all of Latin America via the USA would continue until after the next World War. Then marijuana and cocaine producers and traffickers would create an indigenous source of capital equivalent to and in fact surpassing formal capitalist investment in legal activities. The never-ending demand of North Americans for chemical assistance to finding meaning in life would lead to heroin production moving from Asia to the Americas as well. The Argentine National Bank is the next thing that we want to mention here. Investment money now had to come from domestic sources, that is, during the First World War, and that meant from the government. Thus, money became increasingly concentrated in a single institution, the National Bank of Argentina, which we'll just call BNA. Along the way, this had to create a financial system vulnerable to creative shenanigans as profit centers. Rediscounting, non-performing loans, and so on grew steadily at the BNA after 1914, because what choice did it have? If it was going to spur any kind of development inside the country, it had to take loans, it had to take chances, and this meant that many of those loans would be non-performing or make money in rediscounting ways. The balance sheets became unattractive to non-crony finance capitalists. In its rediscounting actions, the BNA, the government bank, allowed the private banks to shed their risks with bad paper used as security and then lent them cash at 4.5% below the rate the BNA offered its customers on time deposits. In other words, much as the USA has experienced in recent decades, you have all of this money that's been loaned to these banks because they packaged up bad mortgages, sold them to these buyers as good securities, and of course we know now that they weren't. That's why in the 2008 election, or in 2008, the banks confronted the Washington bosses with the fact that if we don't have $1 trillion within 12 hours, this entire economy is going to collapse. Well, at any rate, this is the same thing was happening in Argentina at that time. With the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914, the importance of the Argentine economy shifted as investors turned their attention to Asia. So that was another thing which stopped money from coming into Argentina. In the 1920s, Argentina suffered a decline in the installation of the next generations of machinery that would continue to keep Argentine capitalists competitive with the UK, Germany, and the United States. There's a TV series available on Netflix called Ripper, which is a murder mystery series, but the last two episodes of the first edition are set in a contest between a American shipping company magnate who has come to London along with his Pinkerton thugs against who is trying to put out of business an Argentine shipping company. And so, this might be worth watching from that standpoint, because I believe this is a BBC production originally. It's on Netflix now. And if you're aware of this history that we're talking about right now, then this struggle between the Argentine and the Americans will take on additional meaning for you. Argentina lacked sufficient energy sources in 1914 in the form of coal or hydroelectric power to run what factories it had. Experiments with oil discovered in 1907 in Argentina had poor results. But one of the results was that they formed their first state oil company in Argentina, which is also the first state oil company in all of Latin America, YPF, the Yacimientos Petrolíferos Fiscales. We'll just call that means petroliferous formations, or I guess in English we might call it petroleum-bearing formations. At any rate, so that happened in 1922. As a public company, it was responsible for 51% of oil production in the nation of Argentina, and the remaining 49% would be available for privateers. Exports of frozen beef, especially to Great Britain, proved highly profitable after the invention of refrigerated ships in 1870. You can imagine what a change that was, because if you had to have canned beef before in order to export it, which you did, but it still was being canned, now you could take whole cows, butchered up, and put onto a ship that was refrigerated and sent it anywhere you wanted to, London, New York, or whatever. So this proved highly profitable and caused another boom of capitalist expansion in Argentina. However, Britain imposed new restrictions on meat imports by the late 1920s, and this sharply reduced beef imports from Argentina. Ranchers responded by switching from pastoral to arable production, but there was some lasting damage to the Argentine economy. In this period of time, you're going to see two things happen. Capitalists in the hinterlands will go from farming with raising cattle and sheep, then into agricultural production, because they have a local market and as well as a South American market they can sell food to, and then back to cattle production again, depending upon how meat prices are going. Organized labor, as we've pointed out several times, in Argentina, beginning from the second half of the 19th century up until about 1920, was largely infected by anarchism. Argentina experienced rapid economic growth and industrial expansion, becoming a world economic power. Foreign capital was the driving force for this development, with 92% of the workshops and factories in Buenos Aires being owned by 1887 by non-Argentines, according to one census. Similarly, most of the workers in this period were immigrants, 84% according to the same census. In 1876, the country's first trade union was founded, and in 1887, the first national labor organization. In 1879, an anarchist organization, the International Socialist Circles in English, was founded in Buenos Aires. Both the industrialization of Argentina and its labor movement were centered on the capital of Buenos Aires, and by 1896 there were more than 30 trade unions in the city of Buenos Aires alone. From 1896 forward, the labor movement started developing a clear working class program, and the first sympathy strikes began taking place. That means you may have a strike in your company because you're supporting a strike in a completely different area, and they need help. On March 25th and 26th of 1901, 50 delegates from 35 of these unions met at a congress in the capital, that is in Buenos Aires, to found the syndicalist organization Argentina Workers' Federation, or FOA. Now you'll recall that the difference between syndicalists and us, for example, is that they believe that you can take political power in a country by occupying a factory and just seizing, changing its ownership de facto, which sounds like a more militant program, but in reality what it is they don't want to do what Marx says you have to do, what Lenin said you have to do, which is to confront the bourgeois state with your own armed force and defeat it. Now, people that are not anxious to fight, but on the other hand are anxious to sound like they're militant, are attracted to syndicalism. We don't really have that much of anarchism or syndicalism in the trade union movement anymore, but it's still around. And certainly at that time. From March 25th and 26th of 1901, 50 delegates from 35 unions met at this Congress, formed the FOA with 10,000 members initially. Its founding principles were greatly influenced by anarchists, and I mentioned their names in here, but working class solidarity was seen as the only means of liberating the workers, with the general strike being their ultimate weapon in the fight against capital. Accordingly, they rejected party politics, including socialist parties. Now, the big difference here is the Leninists believed in entering every form of political struggle available. In Russia, for example, even when the Duma didn't amount to anything, Lenin has said, we'll run some guys for the Duma, some Bolshevik candidates. Not that we expect anything out of it, but it's a place where they could at least shoot their mouths off and spout socialist propaganda for us. But the anarchists wouldn't do that, nor would the syndicalists most of the time. They prefer just to boycott the entire capitalist or bourgeois political structure. Marxists still believe in fighting along every area where you can engage the capitalists, and not necessarily just in industrial action, meaning strikes. A wave of successful strikes soon followed, and in 1902 a strike by stevedores in Rosario turned into a general strike. In November of 1902, the Buenos Aires stock workers gained the 9-hour day. That was a big step forward. You wouldn't get something like that unless the capitalists absolutely had to do it. And of course, the good thing that these workers had going for them is that the capitalists didn't have a big reserve labor force that they could call upon someplace of unemployed people. Their previous unemployed workers had gone out and become capitalist farmers, so they're not about to give up their farm and go back to a job that they didn't like that much to begin with. At any rate, they got their 9-hour day by 1902. The important strike of this year, that of the fruit handlers, was about to involve the whole membership of the FOA, the Argentine Workers' Federation, at the height of the harvest, but the government passed the residence law, which allowed expulsion of subversive foreigners to break the strike. In 1903, the General Workers' Union, UGT here, was established as a more moderate, less anarchist, yet more or less syndicalist rival union. Its founding coincided with a further radicalization of the FOA, which would peak in 1905. Infighting between the moderate and anarchist factions of the FOA was a contributory factor. In 1903 and 1904, Argentina saw no less than 12 general strikes and many more strikes at individual plants, with the FOA being involved in many, if not all of them. At the 1903 FOA May Day demonstration, a clash with police left 2 dead, 24 wounded. At the baker strike in Rosario, police shot one worker. However, by 1904, the FOA had expanded to 11,000 dues-paying members. Now we want to talk about the founding of the Communist Party of Argentina, CPA. The party's founders included Luis Recabarren. You will recall we talked about him from Chile because he was going to become he's a Chilean, and he was in Argentina because he periodically was chased by the police out of Chile. And so he was in Buenos Aires, and along with Victorio Codavilla, a man named Kuhn, another named Goldie, another named Mueller, they formed the the European Bolshevik center over there, which as soon as Lenin came to power and issued his 21 points in 1918, one had to adhere to these points and to become a member, and they of course became immediately aware of all of this because the Telegraph was giving them instantly information that was coming out of Moscow. So these guys jumped on the chance to become part of the Comintern. They got some of their friends together, and they formed the Argentine Communist Party. Now, Codavilla was the most important of these founders because Recabarren was going to go back to Chile. But Codavilla, on the other hand, would never leave, and he was president, I think, of the CPA until 1970, as I recall, or head of it, I should say. You also recall that when Recabarren got back to Chile, that he telegraphed Jose Allen in Mexico City, or the guys that were working with Jose Allen, to say he was now ready to join with them, form the Communist Party of Chile, and bring over his entire party that he had already formed in Chile. And so there's the connection between Argentina and Chile and Jose Allen in Mexico City. Chilean Marxists had gravitated to Mexico City, you recall, by 1920, and telegraphically Recabarren had contacted them, and that connection had been made. Meanwhile, back in Argentina, Codavilla was elected to the CPA Central Committee and Political Bureau, to which he would serve until 1970 and when he died. The CPA was initially founded, however, as the International Socialist Party, ISP, we'll call it here, in Buenos Aires in January of 1918, and it sent a Congress to Europe. Not a Congress, it sent a representative to Europe from the left wing of this Socialist Party of Argentina, the International Socialist Party. The second Congress of the ISP was held in April 1919, which is right after the first founding Congress of the Comintern in Moscow. It adopted a resolution to break with the Second International and join the Comintern. So the Comintern accepted the party in 1920 at the Extraordinary Congress of the ISP. In December 1920, they did what was one of Lenin's 21 points. They had to change their name to Communist Party to make it clear where they stood in the International Socialist Movement. In December 1920, the Argentinians in the ISP changed their name accordingly to the Communist Party of Argentina, and they were accepted by the Comintern's Executive Committee. The Communist Party of Argentina Congress adopted a manifesto proclaiming the creation of its party, presented its rules, and issued a declaration of principles. It declared its solidarity with the great October Socialist Revolution and sent greetings to the Russian Bolsheviks. In 1924, Codavilla represented the Argentinian communists at the Executive Committee meeting of the Communist International in Moscow. He was in Moscow. Afterwards, he not only went back to Argentina, but he set up the International Red Aid Society, which we'll talk about later. In December 1926, Codavilla made an address before the Executive Committee of the Comintern, and he was made one of its alternate members. Attending the Congress of the League Against Imperialism in Brussels in 1927, he led the 8th Congress of the Communist Party of Argentina in 1928 and participated in the first conference of Latin American Communist Parties in Buenos Aires in 1930. You'll recall when we were talking about Peru that Mariátegui was going to go to that Congress, but he died just a month before it was held. In his stead went 2 other men, one of whom became the mentor of Che Guevara. During the 1920s, the CPA considerably broadened its ties with the masses in Argentina and was politically and organizationally strengthened, and followed the Comintern faithfully as it executed the necessary twists and turns leading up to and through the collectivization of agriculture and the industrialization of the USSR. The 8th Congress of the CPA in November 1928 characterized the coming revolution in Argentina as being bourgeois, democratic, agrarian, anti-imperialist, thus providing the correct solution to the question of the proletariat's allies in the revolution, meaning it had completely junked all of these ideas of syndicalism and anarchism and accepted reality for what it was, that their allies were going to be the progressive bourgeoisie, and those bourgeoisie were interested in a democratic system of government within their country, that it would be largely based upon an agrarian and anti-imperialist peasant farming classes in Argentina, as well as within the working class, and this provided the correct solution to how the proletariat of Argentina and Buenos Aires and Entre Rios should be looking at their long-term political strategy to gain state power in Argentina. In other words, the day will come when we will see state power by armed force, but in the meantime, we need to build up these our alliances with the liberal bourgeoisie, the progressive capitalists. Upon formation, the CPA set about organizing Argentine labor in its own unions, and this brought it into active work with the General Confederation of Labor, which was a Gompers type of union. You recall we have the same story in every country in Latin America, but if we went through this in some detail in Mexico, and of course in the United States. So what they want to do is to convert this General Confederation of Labor from being a Gompers AFL type of union into a Marxist revolutionary type of union, one that's going to have as its ultimate objective the seizure of state power by armed force. But in the meantime, this is what we're going to do. The CGT was founded on September 27, 1930, with the result of an agreement between the Socialist Confederation, called COA, Confederación Obrera Argentina, and the Revolutionary Syndicalist Unión Sindical Argentina, or USA, which has succeeded to the Fora 9, the Argentine Regional Workers' Federation 9th Congress. This is the way they got out of their organizational ties with anarchism and syndicalism. The COA, which included 2 unions covering rail transport in Argentina, I won't bother with the Spanish names, was the larger of the 2 with 100,000 members. The USA, which included telephone, post, tramway, and public sector labor unions, represented 15,000 members, and as I say, communist-led unions joined the CGT as well. During the 1930s and in industrial development, the CGT became a strong union, competing with the historically anarchist Fora 5, the Argentine Regional Workers' Federation 5th Congress. Centered initially around the railroad industry, the CGT was headed in the 1930s by Luis Cerruti and Jose Domenech, Angel Borlenge, and Francisco Perez Leros. And I've given the names of their unions in here, but the CGT became an Argentine affiliate of the International Federation of Trade Unions, an organization that both the USA and COA had been members of for shorter periods. The CGT itself split in 1935 over a conflict between socialists and revolutionary syndicalists. By socialists here we mean our guys, leading to the creation of CGT Independencia, Socialists and Communists, and the CGT Catamarca, Revolutionary Syndicalists. The latter reestablished the Unión Sindical Argentina, or USA, in 1937. The CGD again split in 1942, creating the CGT number 1, headed by socialist railroaders Domenech, and opposed to communism. The CGNT number 2, headed by the socialist Leros, grouped communist unions and some important socialist unions, such as the Retail Workers Union, led by Borlenge, and municipal workers, led by Leros, into one block. That 42 split, of course, was because of the entry of the Soviet Union into the Second World War. And as you'll recall, Latin America-wide, the Comintern ordered the communist parties to stop strikes on anything that could affect their allies, meaning England and the United States, and their war effort. So some of these people in CGT wouldn't go along with that, the same way they wouldn't in a lot of other countries, which we've discussed as we've gone through these lectures, and so that labor movement split. It's a hard line to sell to some workers that you're going to have to suffer for now and perhaps for several years because we don't want to have a strike against this fat cat capitalist who happens to be supplying large amounts of meat to armies of our allies. From 1930 to 1945, the CPA was banned altogether and forced to operate underground. The 11th Congress of the CPA in August 1946 devoted special attention to the need for increasing educative work among the masses. This was more than a platitude. Many Argentine workers had fallen under the influence of Juan Perón, who was president from 46 to 55, and Eva Duarte. Now, let me just digress for a moment here. What you want to do, first of all, if you haven't seen the movie Evita, is go get it and watch it, because it's historically accurate, and it's also an extremely good movie. Juan Perón was a colonel who was part of the original military junta that overthrew the government in Argentina in 1943. He differed from his fellow reactionaries in one important way, and that is that he was all in favor of a military government based on a strong alliance with the meat packers union especially, but all the unions. And his wife was a radio actress who had a weekly show which was very popular. She wasn't yet his wife, of course, at this time. There was this girl named Eva Duarte, and she had a popular radio show where she would play the role of some woman, important woman in history. And it was very popular across Argentina. She was attracted to him, he was attracted to her. The movie kind of shows you how that comes together. And the two of them together made a powerful combination because she had this radio show which she could use to reach huge numbers of Argentines who listened to the radio all the time there, just like they were listening to the radio, Fibber McGee and Molly and so on up in the United States on the radio. And she was able to throw all of these listeners, not just the workers, behind Perón. And then Perón would go out there and he would take advantage. If there was an earthquake, he would jump into the situation, come in with the army and a bunch of people who would hand out all kinds of help to the people that had been left devastated by remember, this is a country that is constantly having earthquakes, so this was something that he did. He would also come to the direct assistance of the meat packers unions every time they got in a conflict with the local capitalists. So he was a hero of the unions as well. And he was a member of the military junta. In the movie, you'll see that they kind of jump through these stages, but he goes from being just a colonel in support of one of the generals and until he becomes the head of the junta itself. Well, we're just going to, for a moment, now it's during this period of time that the United States begins to take a strong disinterest in Perón and his policies. Remember, the communists have already agreed in 1943 to stop strikes. Perón, on the other hand, is saying, well, what we're going to do is make the capitalists pay you guys. You're not going to be the only ones that have to suffer. So unions, especially those that are what we would call pie card unions, they love Perón because he is going to keep getting them the kind of wage demands, wages, hours, working conditions, demands that they put forward, regardless of the war effort. The unemployment rate in Argentina never went above 10% during the Great Depression. And the country had largely recovered from the Great Depression, that is Argentina, by 1935. So compared to the USA, for example, Argentina's experience with the capitalist depression of 1929 was much better. Uh, it did permanently halt economic expansion for a while, but it didn't last as long by any means. The only thing that got the U.S. out of the Depression was the Second World War. Argentina abandoned the gold standard in December 1929, and for much of the previous period, the country had operated a currency board in which a body known as the Caja de Conversión, the conversion board, or conversion office, was charged with maintaining the peso's value in gold. The devaluation of the peso increased the competitiveness of its exports and protected domestic production. Argentina saw the value of its exports drop from 1.537 million in 1929 to 561 million in 1932, in other words, by about two-thirds. In response to the Great Depression, successive governments tried to transform Argentina to self-sufficiency in industry as well as agriculture. The strategy of growth being import substitution. Accordingly, there were tariffs and quotas for finished goods. The import substitution process had been ongoing, as you'll recall, since 1880, but the Great Depression of 1929 intensified it. The government's encouragement of industrial growth diverted investment from agriculture. So without outside investment, agricultural production also fell dramatically. By agricultural production, they mean crops now, not cattle. Conservative forces dominated Argentine politics until 1916, when the radicals led by Irigoyen won control of the government. Nearly 1 million citizens were allowed to vote out of a total population of 7.5 million. However, immigrants were not, and they represented as much as 70% of the population in the industrial centers. And immigrants, at least 400,000 of which had recently arrived, were not allowed to vote either. So in 1930, the military overthrew the government from power, but political upheaval continued. In 1932, Argentine immigrants wanted to have a contract, had to have a contract before they arrived in the country, or proof of financial means of support. So this was an attempt to keep all of these poverty-stricken masses of the capitalist depressions in Europe from flooding into Argentina. The Roca-Runciman Treaty of 1933 gave Argentina a quote of the British market for exports of its primary products. This meant little, as discriminatory British imperial tariffs and the deflation in Britain led nonetheless to a decline in Argentine exports to Great Britain. Workers revolted spontaneously against unemployment resulting from the Great Depression, and the Communist Party directed much of their anger. Internal migration from the countryside and smaller towns to the cities continued unabated. This is how Evita Perón, Eva Duarte was her name, she couldn't wait to get out of that little place they were living out there in the Pampas. And as soon as she was old enough, like 16 or 17, she jumped on a train and went to Buenos Aires. So did lots of other people. So this was especially true in Buenos Aires, and CPA membership continued to grow exponentially. So the urban working classes led several unsuccessful uprisings before the 1937 presidential elections in Argentina. Traditional export agriculture stagnated at the outbreak of World War II and remained sluggish as UK and German ships sunk Argentine ships. Despite this conservative movement, the Radical Civic Union, with its emphasis on fair elections and democratic institutions, opened their doors to Argentina's expanding middle class, and Irigoyen's policy was to fix the capitalist system by enacting necessary reforms that would enable the agro-industrial export model to preserve itself. It alternated moderate social reforms with the vicious use of army and police force against the social movement. In 1918, a student movement started at the University of Cordova, which eventually led to the University Reform Act, which quickly spread to the rest of Latin America. Meanwhile, the radicals continued Argentina's neutrality policy during World War I, despite the United States urge to push them into declaring war against the Central Powers. Neutrality enabled Argentina to export goods to Europe, in particular to Great Britain, as well as to issue credit to the belligerent powers. Germany sank 2 Argentine civilian ships in 1917, and there was a diplomatic incident which ended with the expulsion of the German ambassador. Urigan organized a conference of neutral powers in Buenos Aires to oppose the U.S. attempt to bring the Latin American states into the European War, and also supported Sandino's resistance in Nicaragua. The tragic week of January 1919, however, during which the Argentine Regional Workers Federation, the FORA we talked about, founded in 1901, had called for a general strike after police shot 700 of their members dead and wounded 4,000 more. Despite being called on by some to initiate a coup against Urigan, de Yappiani remained loyal to the president under conditions that the latter would allow him free liquidation of demonstrations and demonstrators. He began mass killing of workers, therefore, and it continued in the Forrestal British Company and in Patagonia, where one of his generals, Hector Varela, headed the military repression assisted by the fascist organization called the Argentine Patriotic League, where they killed 1,500 workers on strike. On the other hand, Urigan's administration enacted the Labor Code, establishing the right to strike in 1921, implementing minimum wages, laws, collective contracts. It also initiated the creation of the General Direction of YPF, or the State Oil Company, in 1922. Radicalism rejected class struggle, that is, the Radical Party of Argentina, and it advocated social conciliation. Argentina refused to join the anti-Bolshevik bloc. In September 1922, President Urigan's administration refused to follow the cordon sanitaire policy enacted by the UK and France against the Soviet Union. You recall that this was the complete blockade against the economy of the Soviet government, and it's what had forced Lenin to direct Stalin to steal everything they needed from overseas. I'm going to have to stop this tape because I see I'm running out of it, and it looks to me like we're going to have to continue this with at least one more session on Argentina before we get on to Brazil.